It's great. You guys have brought that from downstairs. It's nice to see those of you online. So I get the great pleasure of starting today. Welcome everybody to our geography seminar series. It's a pleasure to be able to be the host today. But before we start, does anybody have a diversity share that they would like to share with us? Anybody online? Me too, right? In terms of keeping that in our forefront of our minds, in terms of things we can observe and read and learn to keep kind of diversity in our forefront. So think about that, and so we can kind of have an opportunity to, as we go through each seminar, to kind of think about sharing that together. Any announcements any of you guys have? Anybody in person here, or anyone want to unmute themselves and have any announcements? It's a quiet crowd today, which is okay. I'm ready to just jump right in. You guys know I'm good at jumping right in. Anyway, it's my great pleasure. I get to introduce the speaker today. This is Dr. Peleg Kremer. We go back a ways. Peleg is actually a alum of UD, and she is graduated with a PhD in the Center, the Energy and Environmental Policy, which John Byrne here, Dr. Byrne here, was a lead on. So it's great to have you here. Wonderful in terms of things.
And the wonderful Ida Schroeder.
Well, I'm getting there. You spoiled that because I wanted Dan Leathers to help me with that. But anyway, Peleg graduated here a number of years ago with a PhD in the Energy and Environmental Policy. And I was on her committee, was very fortunate to be on her committee, but I was not the lead. We had one of the other geography faculty. You guys wouldn't have met her, the graduate students. Her name was Dr. Ida Schroeder. And I was going to think, Dan, when did Ida retire? Was it 2014 to 16?
Yeah, it was probably at least that long.
Okay,
yeah.
okay. So Dr. Schroeder was Peleg's advisor, and I was fortunate enough to be on the committee. And Peleg and I worked really closely together in terms of publishing a paper, which was part of her dissertation. And it was really cool because she was looking at Philadelphia and backyards and what areas could be cultivated for gardens. And so she's really savvy in the GIS and is really savvy in urban sustainability. But anyway, let's get on to what she's doing now. But it's just such a pleasure to bring people back, you know, and see them and come back and give us a talk. Peleg is now right up the road, up 95 to the Blue Route, Villanova University. She's an associate professor there in the Department of Geography and the Environment. And she also directs the Environmental Studies program. Peleg's research lab focuses on spatial patterns of social-ecological systems and urban sustainability. She uses interdisciplinary approaches to spatial analysis, GIS, and remote sensing in terms of investigating the relationships between, you'll see the theme, the urban environment and ecological processes within the built environment. I looked up a paper just to kind of see the most recent one, and she had a paper that was just published 2 months ago in the Journal of Sustainable Water in the Built Environment. Seems like a perfect fit in terms of you guys' research, looking at mapping predicted areas of common maintenance impacts to green stormwater infrastructure in Philadelphia. So she also teaches at all levels, which is pretty cool. Teaches GIS, which I'll have a fun time catching up with her on, and also courses in sustainability and built environment. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Peleg to introduce the title of her talk and let her take over. Thanks, Peleg. We're just going to share the screen. Oh, sure. And we're already in show mode. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. DeLiberty. This is a really great joy to be here. I was very, very excited to be invited. This is actually the first time that I'm back here in an official capacity since I graduated in 2011. So that's been, it's been a while. I had actually woke up really nervous this morning. And it has been like a little while since I've been really nervous, giving a talk. And I tried to figure out what's going on. And then it dawned on me that the last time that I had presented in here, I was defending my dissertation. So that existential dread like came all the rushing back. And so no, but it is a really great joy to be here. I am very fortunate, and the stuff that I do today is all goes back. Everyone here has been very modest, but I had a series of incredible mentors during my time here at CEP, at the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy. I was very lucky to have half of my committee at the center and half of my committee over here in geography, and that meant I really had two homes here and two places that felt a lot like home. So it's definitely great to be back and share a little bit of what I have been doing since I left here. The title for my talk today is Pathways to Sustainable Urban Planning, Relating Urban Structure to Urban Environmental and Ecological Indicators. And that is one part of what I've been trying to do since I have, even before I had started at Villanova. And so I'll give you a little bit of background. I really like to situate kind of where I'm coming from. I'll try to do this pretty quickly because 25 minutes for this is very, very short, and my students know really well that I'm not great at keeping my talks very short. The other thing that I will tell you is that I am recovering from COVID. I do have long COVID, and sometimes what happens is one of the symptoms for me is my recall is a little bit slow. So if I look like I'm struggling for a word, it is I am. And you know, you can try to help me if you think you know what I'm trying to say, and otherwise you'll just need to give me a minute and forgive me if I'm not completely if I'm not completely fluent. It's just, this is the world we live in right now. And so I have a little bit of background here. I think I'm going to skip most of it, and I'll keep that for when all the grown-ups are out of the room and it's just me and the graduate students, because I really like to give, especially when I talk to students, I like to give a little bit of my pathway. For some time, it looked like it was a very linear pathway, and then some things happened and I kind of hit a brick wall and needed to reset and rethink. And this is how I had gotten here to UD. After some interesting discussions with Dr. Burns. And so since that, one thing that I will tell all of you is that my background has been multidisciplinary from the beginning. I know these days it's a little bit more common that you do interdisciplinary work starting at your undergrad, and the INET program, undergraduate program here is one of those examples that were also pretty early. But I started with economics and environmental science. So I have a science degree in economics, and I kind of carried this multidisciplinary thread throughout my studies. And so there aren't that many of us that have like these multidisciplinary, very deep multidisciplinary background. And I think that informs my work and that allows me to build collaboration. I speak a lot of disciplinary languages. I don't speak that many actual languages, just a few, but I do speak a lot of disciplinary languages that allow me to work with engineers, with ecologists, with microbiologists, with geographers, and a lot of people in the spatial science world and sustainability science. And so I think that is a big part of why I do what I do. And I wanted to just give you a very quick background on kind of what are all the things, right? What are all the disciplines that I build on, that I base my work on. And it goes the gamut from the geospatial science and sustainability science to urban ecology, landscape ecology, urban planning, environmental policy, and some economics, not a lot anymore. In the background, there is a little bit of the economist still in me, but I draw on all of these disciplines to inform what I'm doing. And usually what I end up doing and kind of the stuff that I enjoy and my fun is more of the technical stuff. And so I end up doing a lot of GIS work, a lot of remote sensing work, but it's always informed by the questions, the policy questions that we're trying to solve, the human question that we're trying to solve. Who are we trying to approach? Who are we trying to include? And so that's kind of the big background. I'll dive into a little bit more of the specific backgrounds, but my toolkit, and again, because there are graduate students here, my actual toolkits, what I end up, my day-to-day looks like, is usually spatial analysis of urban environments, social-ecological environment aspects of urban systems. I use GIS and remote sensing. I do a lot of spatial modeling, statistical and spatial statistics that are kind of the big frameworks that I use in terms of methodology, more actually starting in my dissertation, but more recently, I have gone much more deeper into field work, actually collecting data in the urban environment. And so obviously using GPS, I do surveys and measurements. We have gotten into mobile monitoring, which I will tell you a little bit about today. Okay. And so the next part of still framing is why care so much about urban social and urban environmental systems. And to me, that really is the urbanization at large is the defining challenge that we have today. I don't have to tell you, geographers, that we have been urbanizing pretty quickly. I sometimes surprise my students when I tell them that while other regions in the world are still urbanizing very quickly, the US has reached something like 80% of its population living in urban areas in the 70s, right? So we have been quite urbanized for quite a long time, but other areas in the world are urbanizing in very, very fast pace. And then I will not dwell on some of the points that are listed here, but really some of our biggest problems, right? If you think about the conceptualization of the ecological footprint, it started with this understanding that cities as these black holes that are sucking resources and energy, right? Using so much more than their allocated, than their actual physical footprint. And so cities do cause a lot of environmental problems. We have a lot of poverty in cities. They are location of some of the extremes that we see in the world, including poverty impacts of flooding and all of that. And I think and this comes from David Harvey, one of the biggest problems that we have, that decisions being made about urban infrastructure, that when we put in place huge infrastructure projects like our highways and our roads and our bridges, like our sewer systems, when we do that, we set in stone one course, right? We set in stone a course that will then determine our fate for hundreds of years. Those huge infrastructure projects are not something that we can reverse on very, very easily. And a case in point is all of the combined sewer problems that we're seeing in a lot of our deindustrializing cities. Every time we have a big rain event, we start seeing sewage directly in our waterways. That's exactly the reason. We put in a huge infrastructure project that now that is now taxed and overcapacity, and we have to figure out end of pipe ways to solve. And so putting in place so when we think about new solution, when I think about urban sustainability, I try to bear that in mind and think about types of solution that will not lock us into something that 40, 50, 60 years from now, we're going to really regret, understand the implications, but not be able to reverse course. And so this is why I'm so excited about working in urban systems. So it's just a lot of problems in the urban systems that we have, but still urban systems are the hubs of innovation. They have always been throughout the ages. Cities is where all the exciting stuff is happening. Cities is where culture is happening, where new ideas come together, when there's enough density for people to exchange ideas. And this is the reason why all of the exciting things that we're seeing comes from the very local level, right? We're stuck on this global effort to address climate change. We're stuck on the global effort to really solve our environmental issues. And I said this not lightly. It's very difficult, but that global process has not done us favors. But we're not stuck on the local scale. We're not stuck. Cities are putting out incredible things. There are cities in the US today that are 100% of fossil fuels. Not many, but there are. And we have about 100 that are expected to be in 20 years, right? So cities all over the world are doing amazing things, are actually way ahead of the curve in terms of the actual solutions that we have. So this is why I like working in urban spaces so much. I do a lot of technical work, but I'm always engaged in the urban system. It was very exciting for me to come back to Villanova because Philadelphia became my hometown again. And so I get to do research in Philadelphia all the time again. And that has been, and I get to connect and reconnect with the organizations that are working there. So urban systems are really important. They're, like, to me, defining challenge. You can have other opinions about what is the most important challenge, but I think we can agree that it is a huge issue that urban sustainability is a really big issue that we need to address. However, we know so little about the processes that create human well-being and overall well-being in cities. And so it wasn't until the latest edition of the SDGs that we added goal 11, that is sustainable cities and societies. Until then, cities were just not part of the SDGs. And it wasn't until 2016 in Habitat 3 that globally we kind of announced this new urban agenda, finally realizing that we need to think about urban sustainability. What came out from there, if well-planned and well-managed urbanization can be, if well-planned and well-managed urbanization can be a powerful tool for sustainable development for both developing and developed countries, right? So we woke up on that global world stage, and we understood that cities are like the locations where we need to solve problems. That hasn't done too much for us, but it did bring to the fore a little bit more of this understanding that we need a research agenda, that we really don't have a well-defined research agenda to understand urban, social and ecological, social environmental systems in the city. We understand it's a huge problem. We don't have the scientific tools to solve that problem. And so that's kind of where my world, where I do my very, very small steps and little parts in, is understanding these global urbanization processes, that our ecosystems are deteriorating. By the way, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment back in 2005, all ecosystems in the world were included in that, except for just one: cities, urban areas, right? So we had did not address this understanding of urban as an ecosystem until very, very recently, in terms of like the span of a discipline, right? So urban social ecological systems are on the map as a discipline, maybe 15 years, right? So everything that we know is just happening. Right? We are, with people who work in this realm, what we are doing is we're chasing our tails to develop methodologies that will help us solve some of these understanding of the relationships between environment and society in cities. And so that's the world that I work in. Not moving. Yeah. And so I see cities I love cities, you can already tell. But the way that I think about cities, this is bringing us back to kind of my fascination with spatial processes and spatial understanding of urban processes. And so kind of on the left here, I hope it's your left too, we see a very iconic picture of Philadelphia, right? This is what Philadelphia has a very unique urban structure. And that's what it looks like. And that's what it looks like when we usually think about urban systems. We think in our head, we usually imagine like these huge blobs of built environment, right? And on the right, and there wasn't really a reason to put it here, but I really had to, there is my first publishable remote sensing analysis product from a paper that Dr. DeLiberty had really worked for 2 years with me to get done. It was one of the early, very fine scale classification of urban space. The purpose of this was to look at how much land is available for agriculture cultivation. But what you see here, and why I put it here, is that you see that actually a lot is going on in between those buildings, right? That you don't see when you look at the picture. And what I'm interested in is all of those, the fine variations of what is happening in between the different parts of our built environment, and how people interact and benefit from those spaces. And so my work is divided. I can generally divide it into a very connected and overlapping areas of research. I will talk about urban structure and structure of urban landscapes and ecological functions today. I also do a lot of work in mapping and modeling of ecosystem services in social ecological systems, thinking about kind of the equity questions, who has access to what types of services that we get from nature in our urban spaces. And then I do not enough of work, like kind of my favorite topic, but the one that I have least time for, working on the urban food system and thinking about transformation of vacant lots into public use resource. I do this work now more as a service. I work with organizations in Philadelphia. If you're interested in that, I know a couple of you here are working on these topics. I'm happy to share what it is that we have been doing. But I want to dive into this thinking about structure of urban landscapes. And I will start by saying that I don't do this work alone. I have a lot of collaborators. I actually have so little time these days and a very teaching forward institution. And so my grad students are doing almost all the work, always. We had started this project with the 3 really nice ladies on top, Dr. Hasse, Dr. Hamstead, and Dr. Laurendale, and just realizing that we're missing a really big piece of the puzzle, thinking about these social and ecological interactions. And then I had collected a lot of collaborators over the year. Everyone there that doesn't have a doctor in front of their name is a student. And my students at Villanova, we don't have a PhD program in any of the sciences. And so they're all master's students and undergraduate students, and you will see their names as leading on the publications because it's them who are doing the work. So I am presenting to you the work, the collaborative work of many different individuals. And this project has been funded by NSF since 2017, for some parts of it, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. Okay. Well, so what is the problem that we're trying to solve? When we think about what interactions we have between environmental, ecological, and social aspects of the city, we really need to be able to understand urban structure, how things are organized inside the city, what is happening next to what. We know this because we have a lot of research that is telling us urban form, what things look like, how things are organized, is really important for all sorts of phenomena, for understanding urban heat, for understanding urban air pollution, how things are organized, have really important contribution. However, we have very little tools in studying how these things interact for a few reasons. One is that a lot of the way that we classify urban spaces mixes together structure and function. A lot of our classification, right, the Anderson classification, kind of the standard, the gold standard, is a land use, land cover classification. It mixes together what is on the ground and how it is being used. And so in our famous NLCD, like the land use, land cover classification we have for the entire US, there are an entirety of 4 urban classes, and they are defined by urban intensity. How much of the land is used for, how much, what percent of each pixel is used for, and is developed on. And that actually, this mixing of structure and function is very problematic when what you're trying to understand is how structure related or drives function. And so in order to get at actual questions of how structure and function relate, we have to get away from land use, land cover, and we have to start thinking about separating, having those separated land cover classifications, and then some ecological, environmental, independent measures that we can then actually relate. Right? If we include some of these measurements in the development of our classification, then it becomes like we can't answer any of the questions that we have. The other thing that we know is really important, it's quite hard to do, is for a lot of environmental and ecological problems, the vertical structure is really important. How high things are and whether lower things are next to higher things is actually really important for how wind moves. It's really important for what different species are able to do. And that is very difficult to get at with a classification system. So we're offering one way. I can't tell you that it's the best way, but one thing is how do you integrate this understanding of the vertical part of the vertical structure of the city into this type of analysis. The other big problem that we have, and that comes from my really frustrated critique of how we do ecosystem services assessments, and that is that we usually, the way that is easy, right, when we have remote sensing data, the easy thing for us is to calculate things per pixel. If that pixel has that NDVI, or if that pixel has, a certain amount of reflection, we can say that it provides, I don't know, it helps us sequester that much carbon. Yay, right? However, we know, and especially from concepts that come from landscape ecology, we know that how things cluster. We know that what patches we have in our landscape is actually really important to understand those relationships. And so the per pixel understanding of urban spaces is very limited and doesn't help us completely understand the phenomena we're trying to understand. So getting away from the per pixel, how do you build an urban classification that has context, right? That's a really big question. And then some other small requirements that it will be automated, that I'm not going to have to sit and digitize entire urban areas, because I will not. I have my share of that in a couple of projects when I was here, and that was it. That it will be systematic and unbiased, and then that it will be reproducible, obviously, and that will give us multifaceted understanding. We're looking for something that will allow us to look at multiple things at the same time, that will allow us to consider environmental phenomena, ecological phenomena. And so we're definitely not the first to come up with this idea. There is our good friends in the Baltimore ecosystem study had put out years ago in 2007, this idea of the Hercules classification that was meant to allow ecological study, ecological research in urban areas, and they had exactly the right idea. They wanted to include building typology, this vertical understanding of the city. They wanted to include land cover, separate structure and function, and just include land cover so we can actually look at function as it relates to the land cover. And so they put out a really great idea for classification. At the time, it required that you would do a lot of digitizing, right? There wasn't an automated way to implement that idea of classification. The idea about local climate zones, LCZs, I know a bunch of you work with it, went a little further and created this urban classification that includes all of these specifically for the purpose of studying urban heat, understanding urban heat island. And it is, in my mind, it's extremely useful classification that is doing one thing. I have still many questions, and I know I've been really looking forward to see Dr. Viren, because I know we have this huge plan to compare what our different classifications are doing. I think it's extremely useful. I see it as very complementary to the way that I think about the structure of urban landscapes. And so on the basis of these really insightful studies, we had come together to try to figure out a classification system that will allow us to understand urban structure in a way that will have all of these things integrated. And so the way that we came up with was to start with a very fine scale land cover, like the one that I developed for my dissertation, but had since become much more ubiquitous. We now have this fine scale land cover developed by the Vermont Lab for about 20 cities in the US. Still not, still very, very few, but we have more and more coming out, which allows us to do research in more cities. So start with the land cover, integrate into that land cover the vertical aspect by integrating, instead of just having built environment or something that is paved, integrating the building type. For this purpose, we chose 3 different types: low-rise, mid-rise, and high-rise. We can talk about the merits of simplification versus including more complex classes, but we can save that for questions. So integrating the vertical aspect into, like, flattening it into our classification, but retaining the information about kind of what is the elevation of the building. And we end up with 8 classes: trees, grass, shrub, bare soil, low-rise, mid-rise, high-rise, paved, and water, that we include in this classification. And then overlaying a grid on top of that. We can also talk about the merits of what pixel size that grid should be, and I have something to show you towards the end here. But overlaying a grid on top of that, and looking inside and counting what fell. What do we have in that grid? What combinations of land covers are happening? And that is a post priori way to get at the urban structure. And so we're not, while LCZs go up front and say, these are the urban classes that happen, and we're going to train our models to pick up those urban classes, we are doing an empirical study and asking what urban classes emerge when you kind of allow the context to come in. And so on 8 classes, you can do the factorial analysis. And correct me if I'm wrong, but there are 255 possible combinations. When you overlay a grid, when you have 8 factors, there are 255 possible combinations. However, we have been doing this for a little while now, and we have tested quite a few cities. And we can say that in most cities, you need no more than 15 to 20 classes to explain more than 90% of city structure. And so there are about, Some cities are smaller. You've seen the picture of Philadelphia. Philadelphia requires way less classes to explain 90% of the city. But New York, Berlin, they require about 15 classes to explain something like 85% of city plan. So we do have some units, some combinations of urban components that are very, very common, right? That repeat in each city and repeat across cities. So when we did this for New York and Berlin initially, and we came up out of the 15 classes, 10 classes were in common, the same classes, right? So that also gives us like a lot of confidence for ability to generalize, ability to say, okay, there's something, there are urban building blocks that are very common. When you look at combinations inside the city, the same classes are going to emerge. Now we can start looking at what that means. And then we went ahead and we did the Philadelphia study, and it came up with like you only need something like 12 classes or 10 classes to explain 95% of the city. 55% of the city is explained by one class, by one combination: trees, grass, low-rise, paved. 57% of Philadelphia is those 4 components. And the other classes are not that similar to the Berlin and New York ones. So that kind of, we understand this. Philadelphia is different, and you know, it doesn't deter us, but it does tell us that there are definitely limits to the power to generalize. But they're also not that different, and I will maybe get to explain that a little bit. So one thing that we're looking at is just this urban structure. These composite classes that include multiple urban elements, how abundant are they? How common, how often do they show up in the different cities? What percent of the city can they explain? So that's the basic. That's the Stirler classification is doing this process, coming up with all of these composite classes. Now, you don't know me, most of you, but I'm a huge fan of like doing the big stuff that can help us explain big stuff for the planners. Like the planners will need me to say, you know, in this class, you really need to consider those issues, right? Medium and low rise are horrible for heating. And so we really need to figure out, like, if you have a lot of these mid-rise next to low rise, you have to do something about cooling, right? Because that's what comes up once and again. I also love to be able to de-aggregate and go into the weeds. So every time we do this classification, we retain the proportions, how much of each of these components are actually are within each one of our grid, our classification grid. And so we can also use that information. We have come to understand that the information, it's not that while eventually our goal is to be able to say this class has these signatures in terms of heat and air pollution and biodiversity, and these are the things that we need to do. If we want to do the studies and we want to continue the research, we also need to be able to model and use our information to kind of generalize to the whole city or to other cities. And for that, the in-class, within-class proportions, how much grass is actually within the pixel. It's not just that there is grass or a minimum amount of grass next to some types of building. It's how much of each of these components. That's what helps us really develop our prediction models later. And so we do that every time we do the classification. We retain this information about the classes themselves and the class proportions. And then we go out and we start looking at relationship between different environmental phenomena and these classes. And so the first thing that we did was look at surface temperature. Ask me why. It's because it's easy. It's because, you know, this whole idea is really nice until you understand that you need independent measurements of an environmental variable at a scale that allows you to understand variation within the city. And the reality, the sad, sad reality today still is that for most environmental and ecological phenomena, that data does not exist. We do not have fine scale, spatially explicit data on environmental issues in cities yet. And so there aren't very many independent measurements that we can use for this. You will see this is why we go out and we generate our own eventually. But as we move with these smart cities ideas and we stopped wiring cities only for cable and things that benefit corporations, we might start wiring cities to understand air pollution, to understand weather, to understand, and that will start deriving more fine scale, specific, spatially explicit information that we can use in this, and that's my hope, at least. And so we start with surface temperature because we have remote sensing data at a reasonably spatial scale from Landsat. And we look at the relationship between this surface temperature and our Sterla classes. And what you're seeing here is our classes on the x-axis, and then on one y-axis, you see the land cover components, the proportions of land covers. And on the other axis, in the black dots and the line, you see surface temperature. And so some of the really obvious stuff is here, right? When we have more paved, when we have more built environment, we get higher temperatures, yes. But it shows more than that. It shows that it's enough that if you see the water categories are the lowest, always water is the major cooling agent that we have. But even when you start introducing a little bit of built environment, a little bit of paved surfaces, that's enough to really hike the temperature, okay? That's enough to hike the temperature. At the same time, when you look at the more built up environment, having a little bit of water is enough to kind of have a mitigating effect. And that's where we think that this more nuanced understanding of context, that understanding how things are organized and how they are and how they're located in the urban environment is really different than looking at whether a pixel is water or not, right? Because we wouldn't be able to know those types of instances. And so when we compared New York and Berlin, the other thing really nice that happened is when we have the same, we compare the classes that were the 10 classes that were common to the two cities. And when we compare them, we see that obviously climate is different between New York and Berlin, but that the same classes have very similar signatures between the two cities. So if it's hotter in this class, depending on the climate, in the same class in New York, in the same class in Berlin, it is also hotter. And that pattern is repeated for all of these classes. These classes are also statistically significant, which I don't think means a lot, but they are statistically significantly different from one another. Okay, so we do have, with surface temperature, we do get these really neat signatures. A class we can expect and we can predict what range of temperature that particular class is going to have. So we did a couple other things with surface temperature in New York. Now we have actually two fine scale land cover data sets 10 years apart. So we can look at a decade of change. And it's a very significant decade in New York because it's the decade that had Sandy in the middle, inside of it. And so we have 2007 versus 2008 versus 2000. This is actually 2007 data published in 2008 and 2017. So we have a decade of change in New York, and boy, New York changed a lot in that decade. So you have some examples of things that really neat things that we found. Here you're seeing a building where a green roof was installed in between. So in 2008 was just like a regular, this is land cover, right? You see what's on top. So this is in 2008, this was just a building. In 2017, we actually have green installation on that roof. Down here, you're seeing something that was a building in 2008. and is no longer a building, is now grassy patch in 2017. And so we looked at the change over time in urban structure, and we found some really interesting things. We have classes that are much more common. You can see the delta. What is shown here is the delta heterogeneity, which means did we add components to the class or did we lose components from the class? Our class is more composite or less composite. And we can say that in different areas in the city, overall, we added about an average of 1.3 classes to our urban area. But you can see the areas are very different. Areas in red and yellows added became more heterogeneous. Areas in blues became less. And I think it's pretty telling that all of the areas in central Brooklyn, Queens, Bronx, Manhattan, all of those areas have seen additions, have seen more complex urban classes. Main reason for this is addition of high-rise and mid-rise buildings. Okay, so those are the areas we're taking neighborhoods. You think about what's happening around Columbia, by Columbia, I should say, taking these neighborhoods and plotting like 9-story buildings, right, in the middle of the landscape of the neighborhood, or what is going on along the water lines in New York, in Manhattan, and in Brooklyn, that is just putting this crazy high rises, skyscrapers. And so we have a lot of that going on in the city, actually a lot of change that is along these lines. And we are seeing the blue areas here that are losing heterogeneity, that are losing classes, are mostly around Jamaica Bay and Staten Island. The two places that were devastated, right, by Sandy, and the two places, and what these classes, this replication, what we're losing is built environment. What used to be houses is now being transformed into marshland, right? It's being actually, it was water combined with something else, and now it's just water. And so we're seeing a lot of that change, and we see corresponding change with the surface temperature. And so what we learned here that we didn't know before is that the more complex the urban classes are, the higher the temperature gets. And so it's not just about, and it is related to, when we move from having built environment with water to having just water, the temperature goes down. When we go the other way, when we add new types of buildings into the mix, temperatures will go up, okay? And so that ability to have a little bit of a temporal component here has been pretty nice. But we are not happy with just continuing to look at surface temperature. I think we will continue to do that because it's fascinating research. We wanted to add, it's really important that we think about the multifaceted idea of if we're going to determine that to offer solutions to planners about what to do with a certain type of class, we want to know that we're addressing or that we're thinking about this from a more holistic perspective of the kind of the gamut of different environmental problems that they have to deal with. Not just heat, not just water, not just pollution, right? We want to be able to say something about other things. And I have a really dear colleague who is an air pollution expert. We came together, we wrote this grant, this NSF grant, that would get us the data that doesn't exist, right? That would get us the distribution of the fine spatial distribution of air pollution in the city. And so the idea here, we only have 3 stations, EPA stations in the whole of Philadelphia. Some of them are right next to the industrial areas, makes them pretty useless for our purposes. And what we decided to do was go for mobile monitoring. So you see my students here, Lucas and Megan putting together the van that we then drive. We have a weather station on top of that van. We have different types of monitoring to collect information about PM, all kinds of PM of particulate pollution. We have an ozone monitor, a NOx monitor, probably forgetting something, and a ton of GPS units. because we cannot put enough GPS units. Some of them always malfunction in the urban area. So they pay a lot for really good GPS units and they still malfunction. And so now we've gone from we thought having like 2 was enough. We now have about 5 different ones. So if one malfunctions, at least one will keep working. So we can we can connect the monitoring, our air pollution monitoring and weather monitoring to locations. So we collect data. Some of these instruments collect every second. Some of them collect every 5 seconds. These are active monitors. So we are getting a recording of the air pollution, particulate pollution, black carbon, NOx, every 1 second to 1 minute, depending on the instrument. And that is connected to GPS location at that same interval. And so we can map, we drive along, and you can see my students here are happy, smiling, right? That's at the beginning of the day. When they come back after 8 hours of driving, you see in kind of the background here, our routes are really crazy. And 8 hours of driving that in Philly, trying to not miss a turn because we're following really strict routes, is actually really hard. And I am just very lucky to have amazing undergraduate students who are so excited, that show up every morning during the summer and are happy to do it. The reason why this route is so crazy is because we're trying to capture as many as we can of those urban structures. And some of them are not that abundant. I said 57% of Philadelphia is the same thing. So if you just drive randomly, you're going to mostly hit this TGPL class. You're not going to hit other classes. So I did a random sampling and stratified by the classes, stratified by the regions in the city. So we capture a lot of the diversity, a lot of the variation that we have in the urban structure. The only thing that we couldn't capture are those individual classes because we're driving, right? So when we're driving, we have pavement. So all of our classes have pavement in there because that's what we're doing. We really wanted to get water alone. And I talked to one student here. She wanted to come do a master in kayak. Just get on the water and get some of their air pollution and weather data. And so the closest we got to just water was driving the bridges that connect New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And then we just have the bridge and everything is water around it, right? So we were able to do a little bit of that, but we capture a lot of the most common classes in Philadelphia this way. And what you're seeing here is a hotspot map, which means what is showing up more brightly are the areas that had high levels of the different types of air pollution repeatedly in all of the days that we drove. But more interestingly for us is we were then able to look at the relationship between the air pollution and our Sterla classes and try to figure out if the picture is as neat and nice as the one that we get with surface temperature. And no, it's not. It's much more complicated, right? It's not. The class signatures are there. Some classes, especially the least composite classes and the most composite classes, have pretty distinct air pollution signature that is statistically significant for the class. But what you're seeing here, I'm not showing you the neat averages here. I'm actually showing you the results for each day that we had, the results for each day that we collected, because I want to make the point that air pollution, differently from surface temperature, actually is impacted by a lot of different phenomena that are regional, even global in nature. So you're seeing some of the very bright days here that we have for PM 2.5. These are days that overall, you can see some days had lower levels of air pollution, some days had higher level of air pollution. Some of those days are days where the drift from air pollution from the West Coast, right, from the fires we had in the West Coast had hit our region, and that blew up, that regional, right, that national phenomena had kind of blew off all of our measurements, right? Everything was really high that day, not because of the urban structure, but because everything was really high that day. So air pollution is a much more nuanced problem. We're trying to tease out the local influences, but sometimes kind of the regional and national influences are just are too strong for us to do that. Still, we have pretty distinct class signatures. So we can say, for example, that those classes that have combinations of low and medium for heat are very bad for heat. Classes that have combinations of mid-rise and high-rise are really bad for air pollution. And that's because of the circulation. The high rises are really disturb the ability to circulate air, and the way that structure, that urban structure works is that it really keeps in the air pollution. And so we see very distinct signature for that class. We also see low air pollution in classes that have more very low, like grass and just paved surfaces. Those are areas that are much more open in their structure. And so air pollution doesn't get trapped so much, and we don't see it recorded in our monitoring as much. And so while the story about the class signature here is not as neat and nice as we would have liked it to be, and we came to understand that our information about the proportions of those different types of urban urban components can actually do a really decent job in helping us predict the distribution, the spatial distribution of air pollution across the city. And so we collected only on those like very long 300-mile two routes, but we could then do a pretty decent job of the combination, combining the class information, the class averages, and then the within class distributions to predict, to do a pretty decent job of predicting air pollution in the whole city. Now, I'm saying a pretty decent. We have the competitor for this is what is called land use regression models. I don't know if anyone is familiar. We use those per pixel land covers and land uses to predict air pollution in similar ways. We actually do a little bit of a better job at predicting. We have, from what we know from the literature, we haven't done the direct comparison for our data yet, which we're working on. But we think this gives kind of having that context, that class context, and information about what's going on within the class actually improves our ability to do predictions. And so it's very rare, like the models that we have from EPA, they use much less fine scale, like much more coarse scale information. And we used random forest regression classification for this. We can say we have a lot of points, so we could actually split our data set 50-50 for verification and modeling. And that gives us a really good indication of how much error we're introducing. And so we can be pretty confident about the level of error, where we are under predicting, where we are over predicting, and we can do that by class. We can say, obviously, the water class, we don't have just water, or the tree class, we don't have just tree. So we tend to under predict. We tend to give those lower air pollution values than we do for the classes that we actually measured. But we have a pretty good understanding of how that error is distributed, and we can take that into account when we think about making recommendations. How am I doing on time? I have no idea. Wrap up? Okay. So we're still doing a lot of this work. We've done a little bit, not quite as much, with air microbiome. The reason it's less, it's because we don't have the actual spatial distribution of the data. We just compare the two different routes that we have, and we still see very distinct differences between the air microbiome in areas that are more open in the city and areas that are more built, and very, very different picture when we go underground into the subway stations. So if you're interested in that, I'm happy to talk more about that. in the questions and answers. I'll skip this. We're doing a lot of verification. This is very early. We are kind of making up a science as we go, right? So we are trying to look at what is some of our assumptions and how they hold up when we do different type of things. One thing that my graduate student Dennis is doing now is we developed this, we developed code to kind of throw at our urban land cover and our air temperature, throw grid at different sizes, and then start rotating the grid 10 degrees every time. And we're doing this repeatedly about 400 times in order to get an understanding whether we should be using different grid, what is the optimal grid size, and whether grid orientation changes the way that we capture classes, changes the relationship between class and the environmental parameter, the air pollution. So this is ongoing. That script has been running for a couple of months now. The smaller the grid cell becomes, the longer the analysis takes. And so, but it is very close to being done. And hopefully I'll be able to, or you can look up the paper when we get to publish it. And so we're trying to identify composite classes that are common across urban areas. We're trying to identify class signatures that are common across, or that are repeat across different environmental and ecological response variables. And the hope is to be able to develop eventually some recommendations for this more multifaceted understanding of urban planning. We're still doing a lot of different projects on this. I'm hoping to collaborate with some of you on those things, and always trying to add new cities. I have a dream to add a city that comes from a completely different planning philosophy. Because so far we have cities in the US and Europe, yes, they're different, but kind of the way that they had been built, the legacy of development is very similar. So I want to do Dhaka next. And so if you have building data for Dhaka, please let me know. And then we're trying to test additional variables such as biodiversity. If you have cities that actually have very fine scale biodiversity surveys, please let us know. We're looking for years now. So I will stop here. Thank you so much for your patience and for being here. And I'm happy to answer any questions, take the discussion anywhere you want.
Thank you. We'll take a question or two before we turn it over to the students. So if anyone here has a question, or if you are online and would like to unmute yourself and ask Pele a question, we'll take one or two questions, then we'll kind of let the graduate students kind of take over and you can pick Pele's brain. I know she threw a lot at us, in terms of all the stuff.
apologize.
Any questions here? That's great, great visuals, a lot of work. Any questions online? We've tapped everybody out for a Friday afternoon. Okay, well, I will let.
That's a bad
everybody
sign.
kind of-
When my
No, it's
students
not.
don't have questions, I'm like, oh my God, what have I done?
So we're gonna kick out the faculty in terms of things, and as the grad students, or you guys stay here for a few minutes? Is that usually the mode of operation? Okay, so we're gonna kick everybody off. Tara Trammell from our College of Ag says thank you. You know her. Okay. She's been on some of committees with my students.
We've been submitting
And
that
Dana.
together for a while now.
Okay,
So
that makes sense. Thanks, Dana. So we'll kick all the faculty and others out, and I'll meet you downstairs whenever you guys are done. And if you hold her hostage for too long, I'll just come back.
yeah, so let's let the adults leave the room. Is it okay if we kind of bunch together so I don't have to?
Sure,
I'll go. I'll come towards you.
You don't need to be on.
Tracy, are you keeping the Zoom open for grad students who are
Oh,
virtual?
so I do need to stay
Oh,
here.
that's a good point. I didn't think about that, but
Yeah.
thank you. we'll let Pele stay here and she's gonna have to shout at the grad students, don't
Or you can
remove.
come here.
Once you're put in place, you don't like that, but thank you for reminding us of that. I
Okay, no
appreciate
problem.
it.
Thank you.
I really need some water. Oh, you need some water? I bet that'd be some, yep. Log it right downstairs.